All right, good morning, everyone. I'm so sorry. Let me set up everyone's faces. I can't see everyone real quick. Okay, perfect. Today we're going to be talking about Django and what Django is actually going to be doing for us. We're going to go over virtual environments. Although I believe we touched up on virtual environments yesterday, and then we're going to go over the installation setup of a general Django project and what exactly it is that a Django app is and what it's supposed to do for us. So let's go ahead and start getting into it since the setup process is going to be probably our most time consuming. So here we have Django. Let's talk a little bit about what Django does. Okay, well, what is Django and why use it? Django is a backend framework, as we spoke about it previously. Not only is it a backend framework, but you can technically create an entire full stack application just utilizing Django. The only problem is that when you create Django templates, which is what gets rendered on the screen for the user interface, you can only use HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, which, as we saw, is also very powerful, but it takes a little bit of more elbow grease to actually get it to work and look nicely. Whereas if we utilize React, React is a lot more developer-friendly tool that we can utilize for front end. So we're going to dedicate our front end user interface to React. All right, we're also going to go over the Django ORM. Well, the Django ORM, as everyone here knows, there's operational risk management. That's not what this is. This is wow, I just totally forgot. Relational mapping, object relational mapping. There you go. I tricked myself. So now we know what an object is in JavaScript. And pretty much when we go into Python, we're basically just going to be writing all of our models, which are going to turn into data tables, as we see here soon, into classes. So we're going to be writing a class that will essentially turn into a data table once we actually go and push it into Postgres. And we'll see that here shortly. It has RESTful APIs capabilities, and a RESTful API. We'll go into what all that a RESTful API entails over the next couple of days. It's too much to explain for me to quickly cover it in about 30 seconds. Okay, and then the next thing is it's very versatile and it's portable. So let's go ahead and keep going. Okay, so I just want to keep going, go a little bit over what portable means. Portable means that all of the dependencies that fall into Django can be easily captured inside of a Python virtual environment, and we can pass it between different machines, and everyone should be able to easily install everything that's inside of that Django project, pick up the project, and work together. All right, does anyone have any questions about what we've covered so far about what is Django and why Django?
So, Django is a Python backend. Do you program in Python then?
That is correct. Yes.
Okay, that's awesome.
I had a quick question. So our assessment is going to be on SQL and databases. Is there going to be any Django in that? I see that there's a specific Django assessment as well.
Yeah, are you talking about your assessment that's coming up this Friday?
Yep.
So, and let me just clarify your question. Is your question, are we going to touch on any SQL material while doing our Django module for the remainder of this week? Is that your question?
No, more is Django going to be on the assessment this week, seeing as we have a specific Django assessment in 2 weeks from now?
Perfect. Yeah, so now I fully understand your question. No, Django will not be in this assessment. This assessment will be purely SQL queries, building data tables, and only SQL related information. Our Django assessment will be where you guys will create your own RESTful API later on. Does that answer your question?
Yep, thank you.
Of course. Any other questions?
I was just curious because you said that Django has the capabilities to build like a full stack application, but is that something you ever really see in the real world, or is it just something that it has the potential to do even if people don't use it?
It's something that it has the potential to do, but I don't think many people use it nowadays. At least no decent. I don't want to throw any shots at anyone, but at least no decent website or place that's trying to run a website will use Django templates to render their front end interface. Okay, perfect. Yeah, and then just so everyone knows, something really cool that I just recently found out is that apparently Instagram's backend is made with Django. So let's go ahead and keep moving forward here. All right, so let's talk about virtual environments. So what are virtual environments? We went over this a little bit yesterday. Sorry, I just missed a question on the chat. Here we have a question saying it's from Michael Lake, and he says, what's the main reason we're learning Django? So the main reason we're learning Django is because we're gonna use it as our backend framework to be able to learn how to create RESTful APIs. Does that answer your question, Michael?
Yeah, no, I was just curious, given what we were saying earlier, that it's not like super used in the industry. I was curious, as like,
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, the front end capabilities of Django is what doesn't get used in the professional world, but the back end capabilities definitely do. Does that make sense, Michael? Okay, I see some head nods. Perfect. All right. So virtual environments. We talked about this yesterday. Can anybody educate me a little bit on what a virtual environment is and what it is that it's doing for me?
Just pretty much protecting you. It's providing like a little bubble of safety to, you know, mess around, goof, and to code, do everything, and it doesn't like melt or destroy your computer.
Yeah, perfect. What does the RESTful part mean? I will go over what REST and full means here shortly. But that is a great question. And I think Dave just shared an answer as to what a RESTful API is. Perfect. Okay, so just like Gray said, a virtual environment, once we start a virtual environment, it's basically gonna provide us a playground where we can do different types of installments so that it doesn't affect the rest of our computer, right? A perfect example that's inside of the README lesson is, all right, well, we all know that on our own local computer, we're all running the latest version of Python, right? But as we're running the latest version of Python, what if we go and work at a specific company and this specific company has some code that was created in Python 2.8, right? Or some really old version of Python. And we need to make sure that whatever code we're adding in there is also based on the same version of Python. Well, that's where virtual environments come in. There would be a requirements.txt that's attached to that specific code base, and we could download it, all of the requirements from that requirements.txt into a virtual environment without hurting our local computer. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, perfect. So any questions about virtual environments?
I mean, we've been using them for a while, at least I have, because that's, I mean, just another example is WSL. So, I mean, that's a whole that ties in, correct?
Right, yeah. So WSL is a virtual machine, but it essentially does do a form of what a virtual environment does. Is that what you're asking, Dave? Yeah, perfect.
Yep.
Awesome.
We have to custom set them up each time we use them, or is there like, can you like default certain things to run on a beginning one?
Could you clarify that a little bit, Chris?
Like we had to download, I can't remember the name of the program yesterday. Psycho PG yesterday. My understanding was in a new virtual environment, we have to install it every time. Is there a default way to like have specific things that we're installing like every time we open up a virtual environment?
Yeah, so what you're talking about is going to be a requirements.txt, and we'll go over that here shortly about how to grab a requirements.txt and install everything that comes from there. But mainly, the main reason why you want to start different virtual environments for each specific version is, for example, yesterday, everyone here installed Psycho PG3, right? About pretty much the last cohort was still working on Psycho PG2. So all of their virtual environments have the Psycho PG2 versions. And if any of you try to run their projects on your local host, it would fail because you guys don't have Psycho PG2, right? So you would have to install their requirements.txt into your virtual environment to be able to run their project successfully. Does that make sense, sirs?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. All right, so Django setup. When creating Django apps, which we'll go over into what that looks like here soon, we must ensure to apply the dry concept. Does anyone know what dry stands for?
Don't repeat yourself.
Right, so don't repeat yourself. It's right there, right up on the screen. Something that I like to think to myself whenever I'm coding is the dry syrup, right? Because we all love acronyms, and that's the one I came up with. So dry is don't repeat yourself, and then syrup is the single responsibility principle, so SRP, right? Meaning that one specific function or method is supposed to only do one thing. So just keep that in the back of your mind whenever you're creating your apps or models and your functions. All right, so let's go into Django folder structure real quick. Whenever we go to set up Django, we have our project, right? And our project is basically going to be a direct link to our SQL database. And then after that, we're going to create apps, and all of those apps are going to link to the project. And each individual app is going to contact the project to then contact the database. And then the database will contact the project to contact the apps. And that's basically how the actual structure here goes. One way to think about apps, and I wonder if I have another slide for it. Yeah, perfect. So the Django folder structure. So we could use this picture to pretty much think of an application as a freezer, right? And each individual ice cream that's inside of that freezer, it's standing for its own model or portion of the application. If we break down something like, for example, let's say, I'm trying to think of something simple. Let's say we log into Amazon, right? There's going to be a user model, and that user model probably has an app. And then that app, that's where all of your information about that specific user is stored. Just one little ice cream tub is holding everything that can possibly, that Amazon needs to know about you. Now, another ice cream tub is probably holding all of the products, their names, their prices, how much quantity there is. And each individual app, there's a cart, there's going to be some way to search for something. Each app will be divided so that if one of those apps fails or breaks down, the rest of the application still works. It's just one specific portion of your app that's not working. Okay, thank you for the access to the slides. I'll make sure to update that here soon. And then I see a question here. So should our VMV be in or outside our Django project file with the apps or one level above? Yeah, that's a really good question, Jesse. So when it comes to where your virtual environment is located, it doesn't need to be located inside of the same directory or anything like that, because eventually once we go to push it, we never want to push our virtual environment up to GitHub. We'll go over gitignores here in this lesson shortly as well. But basically our virtual environment should never be shared with anybody else. That's what our requirements.txt for. You could put your virtual environments inside of a folder at the root level of your entire computer. Maybe you can make a directory that you call environments, and that's where you put each individual virtual environment. But it really doesn't matter where your virtual environment is located, as long as you're able to activate it, make installments into it, and then deactivate it. Does that answer your question, Jesse? I can't see you, so I don't know if you're saying yes.
Yeah, that was perfect. I was just kind of confused on where I should put it at.
Okay, perfect. All right, so this is what the Django would actually look like. All right, so we're in our root folder. We go ahead and create our virtual environment. After we create our virtual environment, we're gonna upgrade our pip. Well, first we have to activate it. Then we're gonna upgrade our pip. We'll install Django, and then we can start a project. Don't forget the period, please. And then after that, you can start your application. So let's take a look at what that looks like before I keep moving on with the slideshow. And I think it's right here. Okay, perfect. So the first thing I need to do is create a virtual environment. So I'm going to go ahead and create one. And I have a tendency of just naming one EMV, so I know it's an environment. So now I can use the source command, go into bin and activate this virtual environment. And now we can see EMV on my left side. Okay, after that, I want to go ahead and upgrade pip, and I think that's going to be pip -- upgrade pip, I think. Nope.
Hey, Francisco, I just had a question on, so when you're naming your virtual environments, like, could you call every one of them then, or whatever you want to call, like, could they have the same name?
If they're in separate directories, they can definitely have the same name. If they're living inside of the same directory, you're going to get a problem saying like, hey, this file already exists or something like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I just wasn't sure, like, if, like, what level it kept track of that on, or if it, like, how much it mattered. But
yeah, it's like a file, right? So if I have hello py there, and I go to make another one. Well, the same one was created, but we can see that it was overwritten. So I can say like print hello. And then I run this command again. Oh, it actually didn't overwrite it. It just recognizes that there's already one built and doesn't make a new one. So there we go.
So if you accidentally called like the same environment twice, like you could overwrite your old one?
No, it looks like it doesn't overwrite it. It just utilizes the old one.
Okay.
Yeah, but you don't want that. You want to make sure that every virtual environment you create, because I'm assuming you're creating a virtual environment for a new project or new set of dependencies. So you want them to be separate from one another. Does that answer your question, Del? I see your head nod. Thank you. She would name the EMV the project name too if we have multiple, or does it matter? That only depends up to you. Oh, sorry, someone was talking.
Oh, sorry, I was gonna say, kind of Della's question kind of answered mine.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let me go ahead and grab this command real quick. So it's python-m pip install upgrade. Okay, here we go. So python-m pip install -- upgrade, and then pip. There you go. So now it's going to update my pip. So it's the newest version of installment. Okay, Bennett seems to be answering some questions on the chat, so please don't miss out on that content. And I can go ahead and install Django. Well, now that I pipped install Django, I can say Django admin, start project, and then I'm just going to name it Pokédex. And I'm going to preface it with project. And actually, you want start project to be all together, not to have spaces. And then I'm not going to forget the period at the end. And now when I go to run this, we can see that Pokédex project opened up. And inside of Pokédex project, we have a bunch of files that will go in here shortly. And then we have our manage.py. Okay, so currently right now, the only thing we're missing is our app, but I don't want to go into apps just yet until we finish this slideshow. All right, so any questions over the folder setup or how we went ahead and installed Django, upgraded?
Should we be coding with you?
You can if you would like. I would prefer it if everyone just got a solid knowledge over what I'm doing by watching. But if you're the type of person who learns better by typing along, please go ahead. Just I won't be able to stop the class if you run into a bug. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I'm the type of person who learns best when I code along. So when I went through the program, I coded everything at the same time the instructor did. So that's definitely on your guys' call. All right, any other questions? Okay, so now let's go into ORM. What is it that it's doing, right? So here we go. In the ORM, our lesser objective is we want to build a Django application that's going to be linked to our project and that will talk to our database. So we're going to go ahead and sync our Django with PostgreSQL. And what we're going to be utilizing is we're going to be utilizing the same library that we used yesterday, which was PsychoPG3. This is their icon, just in case you've never seen it before. And basically what PsychoPG3 is going to do is going to grab all our Python code and it's going to turn it into SQL queries so that by the time it gets to Postgres just runs whatever it is that it's getting from PsychoPG3. All right, and then here are the commands to set up PsychoPG. We could go ahead and install PsychoPG, and then in brackets is going to be binary, and that will install PsychoPG3. We want to create our database, and then we want to change the database name in settings.py, all that good stuff. This might be better if I just demonstrate it. Let me make sure that there's not another slide here. Okay. Yeah, we'll definitely demonstrate this shortly after all of these steps. Don't worry about them too much right now. But here we can see Django is going to go ahead and contact PsychoPG3, and then PsychoPG3 will talk to our Postgres database to do whatever it is that we're telling it to do. And the same interaction would work backwards, where the database would then respond to PsychoPG3, and then PsychoPG3 would then respond to our Django project. All right, so this is what a model would look like, right? So we have a Django ORM, which is the operational relation mapping. And basically we can create a data table by creating models. And here we see a data table, right? The data table is called student. It has a name, an email, and a Boolean field for a good student. Well, what would that look like if we did it in Django? So in Django, we would have a class named student, right? We would preface it by models.model so that Django would know, hey, this is a model. This is not just a random class that I created. This is specifically intended to be turned into a data table. And then we can see the same fields. We have name, and it looks here like we put name to a char field, and we gave it a max length of 250. We have email, and now we put it kind of a constraint onto it where the only thing that we'll accept here on emails will be an email field. So what this will do is it's going to check that whenever we pass something in there, the email field will have like an @ sign and a dot something at the very end. And that's just one of Django's many built-in features that it will do. And we have our good student, which again, we put to a Boolean field. Now we have a default here at true. We didn't give a default in the name. But in line 6, we see this unique true. Well, this is going to force the database to not accept any input of email where the email would be repeated or already exists before. Okay, does anyone have any questions on this?
So the table is a class and you're declaring that by using models.model?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. All right, if there are no questions, let's go ahead and see some code. Okay, so currently right now I have this Pokédex project, all right, and I'm gonna go ahead and create an application now. And actually, before I go into creating that application, let's go into the database or what settings looks like. So here's settings.py. There's a couple of things that I need to know and a couple of things that I don't need to know currently right now. By the end of the course, or by the time we go ahead and finish our Django module, we're going to be very familiar with everything that's going on here in settings.py. So the secret key. This secret key is something that you don't want to necessarily publish to GitHub or for anything that you're actually going to be using in a production environment. The secret key needs to be hidden. And we'll go over how to hide things here later on in the module as well. But just know that you typically don't want to go ahead and publish the secret key. For any of the assignments that we currently have, feel free to. It's not like someone can have access into your computer, but people can definitely do things with your project once you go and create something in production if your secret key is exposed. So debug is equal to true. And debug equals true is basically just going to tell us whenever we make a mistake, it's going to give us a, hey, you made a mistake. This is likely what it is, et cetera, et cetera. When we go to push to production, debug, we're going to turn it into false. And that's when somebody types anything crazy into the URL. All Django is going to do is return either a 500, which will be an internal server error, or a 404. Like I have no idea what you're looking for. But it won't necessarily provide us any sort of warning or answer as to, hey, what are you doing wrong? Allowed host, we'll go into that once we go into deployment. But basically, once we deploy our site, this is where we would say our site's URL or whatever registered domain it is that we have. This is where it would go. And that's what would basically create a security measure so that if anybody else tries to get into our Django backend project and they're coming from an outside host, they just can't do it because they allowed host won't allow them to. And here we have installed apps. So installed apps, it comes with a lot of different things. We have the admin site, which we'll see later on today. Auth, which is just basically authentication. So to start your virtual environment, it's going to be source, the name of the virtual environment, /bin/activate. All right. And then we got content types, sessions. We'll go into sessions here as well, because we need to understand what exactly a session is and a session ID and how it happens. And there's a couple of other things here. When we go here into middleware, I really don't want to break this down too much, but middleware essentially is everything is telling Django like how it should function, how much security it should have, how it should handle session IDs. What's the common middleware? Well, common middleware is just anything that can be used in different classes, and it's just common altogether. We have our cross-site reference origin. I can't remember exactly what CSR stands for, but it's cross-site reference and then forgery. There you go. And how to handle that. And we'll go into what cross-reference forgery is as well later on. Okay, we're going a little too in-depth into all the in-depth things about Django, but the important thing is we want to get down here to where it mentions the database. So now, once you guys make it into the industry and you're working with other frameworks, you'll see that it's actually pretty complicated to connect to your database with other frameworks. Well, with Django, it's as simple as grabbing this SQLite and changing it to PostgreSQL. And instead of this base name, I don't want it to go into the space directory. Instead, I want it to track my Pokédex database. Okay, so now I have a Pokédex database. I'm going to go ahead and open up a new terminal. And in this terminal, I'm just going to go ahead and go into Postgres. I'm going to go ahead and check what in all databases I have. Okay, it doesn't seem like I have a Pokédex, so I'm just going to go ahead and create that real quick. So create database Pokédex. Oh, forgot that. Okay, and now that that's been created, I can go into Pokédex. All right, so now I have my terminal. I see Pokédex is created and PostgreSQL is connected. And we'll see all the connection here soon. All right, back to Python. The next thing we need to do is, as we saw earlier, we need to make sure that Django is able to talk to our database. So what package is it that I need to install so that my Python code can talk to my SQL?
PsychoPG.
Yeah, so I'm just going to go ahead and install PsychoPG. So pip install PsychoPG binary. We can see all those installments coming along here. Okay, so now PsychoPG is able to talk. If I take a look at my folder, nothing has really changed. So let's go ahead and actually change some things here. I'm going to go ahead and clear my terminal. And here, I'm going to go ahead and create my app. So I'm going to say Python manage py. And I'm going to start an app. I'm just going to start off with Pokemon. I think that's what today's lesson starts off with. Let me double check here. Yep, starts with the Pokemon. And I'm going to go ahead and name it app so that I know it's an app. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and run this. And now we see this folder just basically magically being created. Well, what's inside of the Pokemon app? Let's take a look here. Well, we can see all of these things. We really don't need to worry about. We'll go into admin and how that works here shortly. We're not going to be putting any extra types of apps in here, so we need to worry about that. But we do have models, and that's what we're learning about today. And later on, we'll learn about tests and views as well. So now that I created this app, inside of Settings.py, I need to make sure I add it inside of my installed apps. Otherwise, I won't have access to it. Right? I have this Pokemon app, but currently right now, my Django project has no idea it exists. Even though I used it with the same manage.py, my installed apps has no idea it's there. So I'm going to go ahead and add it. I'm going to say, well, now I want you to know that there's also such a thing as the Pokemon app. And just like that, it's going to go ahead and look at the base directory of the project and look for Pokemon app and then access all the files that are inside of it. Okay, so let's go into models. What is it that we want to create? We want to go ahead and create a Pokemon. And today, for this part, let's just keep it something very simple. So as we mentioned previously, I'm going to do that by saying Pokemon, and I'm going to bring in models.models. Yeah, and as I mentioned previously, in the end, what I want to do is I want to create a replica of the Poke API. So let's take a look at the Poke API. Let's see what things they have. Okay, well, they have abilities, forms. It looks like all of these are extra. Okay, so now height, that's something that should be along with Pokemon. ID, we know IDs are auto-generated. Moves, that looks like it's a separate data table as well. And we see that there's a couple of things here, but let's try to keep this simple and just go with, let's go with name, weight, and height. Let's do that real quick.
Francisco, I'm sorry. I think I'm losing you a little bit. Maybe I'm the only one, but I'm trying to understand, what are we trying to create? Like, what is the purpose of this app? What is it supposed to do? The Pokemon app.
Yeah. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to recreate this entire API. And the Pokemon app is basically just going to concentrate on any functionality that goes into an individual Pokemon. So each app should be correlated specifically to a model. We don't want multiple models inside of an app unless it's something really small that we know only pertains to the specific model, right? So in this case, our Pokemon app will only have one data table, which will be Pokemon. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create the data table here by creating the model. And then after that, we're going to use views and other things to be able to interact with the specific model. Does that make sense?
It does. It does now. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah, and I apologize to everyone if I missed that. Does anyone else have any questions? I might have gone over a lot of things in a pretty quickly. So please, if you have any questions, go ahead and shoot.
So Pokemon _ app is only going to have one model, you said?
That's correct. Yes.
And it's going to be all the type of Pokemons.
It's going to be a Pokemon data table. We can definitely add types later on, but we're not necessarily only tracking a specific type of Pokemon. We're just tracking all Pokemon.
Okay.
Feel silly saying Pokemon so many times. We got to find a better topic for this lesson. All right.
Hey, Francisco, just real quick to clarify, our main project is Pokédex project, right? And then the Pokemon app lives kind of inside, like that's going to be a app inside of that project.
Yeah, so this app is only related to that project, and that project is currently only grabbing from that app because we put it under installed apps. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so that's like the parent. That's like I think like the parent folder where all our other, if we had more apps, our other apps are going to be like calling from that one, or living kind of inside of it.
It's not a parent directory because it's not nested, but it is the parent, meaning that's the only access point that you can utilize to get to the other apps. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Francisco, can I sidetrack you for one more second? It'll be really quick.
Yeah, of course.
Going off what Bennett said in the chat, he said, so in a normal scenario, we would keep our virtual environment outside of the same folder that we're working in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, but in this example that you're showing, you have it in there.
Oh, yeah, so I have mine in there just because I know that once I create a gitignore, it really doesn't matter where your virtual environment is. But if you have a specific place where you prefer placing your virtual environments, you can definitely place it somewhere else.
Okay, and we'll go over gitignore. I remember Ben going over it briefly before, but we'll go over that again later.
Yes, we will.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Of course.
I have one quick question too while we're stopped. Apologies. Can you just break down and explain what what's going on in the terminal and how you got that, how that code opened up this new file and all those different files inside of it?
Interesting. Yeah, definitely. So terminal, this is as far back as I can go. So we created
just mostly that last line. Sorry, like the manage PY start app, Pokemon app.
Got it. Okay, so this start app is basically a functionality that belongs to manage PY. So let's take a look at manage PY here. I don't know if we could actually visualize it. Okay, we won't be able to see it because it's utilizing this whole thing. But basically what this does is it takes arguments that we pass into it. We can see that it's using the system output. I don't want to go too much into what's actually the functionality that's happening here on DEF main, but basically it's taking whatever arguments we pass in and then throwing them in here. So we see, okay. Yeah, so we see here that it's using the Django setting module, right? And that doesn't live currently in my, oh, actually it does live on my computer, right? And it's inside of settings. And then I'm telling it where to reference. I'm telling it to reference, well, my project in .settings. And then we can see here that it goes into .core, .manage, and it does a couple of other things. But this execute command, I wonder if I could see what's in there. Okay, this would take us down a pretty big rabbit hole, and I don't want to lose the class. Basically, manage PY is going to go ahead and take start app, which is a functionality that belongs to Django, and it's going to create an app for us that comes with all these files, because Django knows that when we make an app, we need these files to create a well built application that we would want to deploy eventually. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I was just getting some errors when I tried running that in, but I can troubleshoot that on my own. Thank you.
Of course, perfect. Just make sure you're inside the proper directory, because if you don't have access to manage PY, it'll freak out. All right, so now going back to the models, let's keep it simple. Let's go over name and level real quick. And we already went over how to create a database. So now when we go ahead and create a model, well, what would we want the name to be?
Varchar.
Yeah, so we want a varchar. But when we do varchar inside of our model, what we want to use is we want to use models. We're going to use char field here. And then we can have to specify the max length. So let's go ahead and give it maybe a max length of 50, since I don't think Pokemon names are that long. And the next thing we want is, let's say we want to create a level. What would a level be? What kind of field?
Integer.
Integer.
Yeah. So models dot.
So I'm assuming the models dot, char field, integer field is just a syntax for how it's written using Django.
Yeah. So the models,
methods.
Models is in reference to the module that we're importing up here. So here on line 4, we can see that we're saying, hey, this is going to be a model, and we can put an upper letter there for the class. And this is basically telling Django, like, hey, this isn't just any class. This is going to be a data table, and you need to ensure that you grab everything here and turn it into a data table. So then next, when I clarify name, well, I know this is a data table, but what is name in reference to my data table? Well, I want you to grab the models package and grab the char field function, and that's what's going to go into my data table. And same thing with level. Does that answer your question, Roger?
Yes, it does.
Francisco, the so Pokemon class Pokemon inherits from a model class in the models package, correct?
Currently, right now, yes, it's using inheritance. Yes.
Got it. Thank you.
You specify a primary key also.
We don't have to specify a primary key because all of our models are going to be created, and as we go ahead and make new entries into the database, the primary key will be automatically generated. Okay, so now we have our integer field, and in our integer field, we could give it a couple of different values. Is there any value that we want to give it here? I know whenever I played Pokemon, the lowest level I would always find would be like a level 2, right? So maybe we could put that in there. So let's go ahead and say, well, the default value here is going to be 2. Like that's the default. Any Pokemon that we create, we don't necessarily have to pass a level in here. It's just going to create a Pokemon with a name that we pass, and it's going to set it to a level 2. But Tatas are trash. Yes, they are. You are correct. All right. So now we created our model. So this is all great and all that we created a model that's basically supposed to represent a data table. But if I go here and I run /d to see what's going on, we can see that there's no relationships. There's nothing going on in Postgres right now. This doesn't exist. Okay. And we can see that we have this migrations folder. And currently, if I look at my migrations, all there is an init.py, but nothing else is in there. So what can I do here? I want to make sure that this model gets into my database. And on Friday, when we were in the SQL workshop, I remember all of you asking these questions about, hey, well, what about the database? How does that interact? And what's going on with the backend framework? And they mentioned something called migrations, right? So these are our Django migrations. And our Django migrations are basically just going to control and keep a record of every single different alteration that we make to our database. So let's go ahead and make some migrations. So I'm going to say Python, manage py, make migrations. And when I run this, we can see, hey, the Pokemon app has created a migration 001. It's the very first migration that we've created for this app. And we're going to create a model Pokemon. Okay, so let's take a look here. All right, so now we see our migrations has a PyCache folder. That's just some Python trash stuff that gets stored in there. We don't really need to worry about the PyCache. But we see the 001 initial. So let's take a look at 001 initial and what it's doing. Okay, so 001 initial, as we look at it, we see it's initial and it's set to true, meaning this is the very first element. It has no dependencies, right? And we can see here the operations. So what is it doing? Well, I'm telling it to create a model, right? This specific migration is going to create a model. The name of that model will be Pokemon. And here are the fields that are going to be created. Well, you're going to create an ID field. Here we see the big auto field, auto-generated or true. Primary key is true. We see that the verbose name is ID. We see the name, and this is basically our SQL query as we're used to seeing it, right? So that's what Migrations is doing. Will you ever have more than one app in your project? If so, how does it know which app to put the migration under? Yeah, that's a really good question, Don. And we'll definitely go over that later on once we start dealing into multiple apps. Right now, that question is a little bit out of scope, but we can definitely talk about it after class. All right. So here we have our initial. We know that it's going into, could you explain the dependencies real quickly? Yeah, definitely. So dependencies, we see that it's a list, right? And as we start making more and more migrations, this dependencies list is going to grow, meaning that I can't create a migration without having a record of what the prior migration to that was. What does that sound like to everyone? When we went over data structures, we went over a specific data structure where the next element cannot exist unless the prior element was there.
Linked list.
Right, it sounds like a linked list, right? And that's essentially how dependencies is working. Here we see that it's the initial one, so it has no dependencies. There's no prior entries. But later on, as we start making different alterations to our data table, that dependency list is starting to grow. So every time anybody else installs the application, they have a record over how the migrations happen and how we built the database. For Noah, if you make migrations and it return no changes detected, it's likely because you don't have the app under installed apps. All right. Okay, so now we made our migrations. And now let's take a look at Postgres again. Let's run /d. Well, nothing's there yet. Okay. So now the next thing is we made our migrations, but our migrations are just making a record, right? Now we actually need to send the conversation over to Postgres by running migrate. So let's go over back to our Django terminal, and let's go ahead and run migrate. And say Python manage py, and I'm going to run migrate. Okay, so now migrations happened, and we can see a bunch of things were added. So we have an auth model that was added, and these are all pre-built models that come with Django. Basically, they come with different methods of authentication, different methods of admin. We see a lot more of auth, as you guys can see. Django takes authentication very seriously, and it provides many built-in package to make our lives easier and ensure that our users are secured. And then at the very end here, we see Pokemon app, and the Pokemon app is at 001. Okay, well, what does that mean now, right? If I run /d now, well, now all those data tables that I just migrated from Django are inside of my list of relations inside of my SQL. Yeah, so Roger, make migrations will create the record of what a migration looks like, and migrate will send all of those records into SQL, right? You cannot migrate without there being a new record of a migration. And that's why you have to run make migrations first before you migrate. Does that answer your question, Roger?
Is it like add and commit?
That's one way of putting it, definitely. It would be like a commit versus push, rather, where commit would be creating the record, and then push would be pushing it into your DB. Okay, I saw that.
Francisco, where?
So go ahead.
Francisco, I'm sorry. Where is the database Pokédex? Where in our code is it referenced to push to that specific database?
Yeah, so that's happening here in Settings.py. And let me show that real quick. So in settings.py, I'm telling it to go to PostgreSQL. And the name that it's going to be looking for inside PostgreSQL is Pokédex.
Got it. Thank you. I think I had its SQLite.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, so now we can see here we have the Django migrations are being put in there. So even my database is tracking what the difference of the migrations are so that no one can go in there and just mess up my entire DB now. And now we can see at the very bottom, we see the Pokemon app _ Pokemon. Okay, so let's go ahead and write a quick SQL query real quick. So select all from, Pokemon. And now when I run the select from, okay, I caught it. Okay, perfect. So this is what HTTP transfer protocol checks for. I don't want to go into that yet, Chris, but you're definitely onto something that we'll go over later on. So right now we see ID, we see the name and the level, which is exactly what I wanted it to have, right? I can't necessarily see the constraints, but now anytime I want to add something in there, instead of adding it here, I can add it utilizing Python. And we'll see what that looks like here shortly. Okay, but so far, what we did is we created a virtual environment. We then activated that virtual environment. After activating the virtual environment, we went into settings.py, changed the name of the database that we're utilizing, as well as ensuring that this is PostgreSQL and not SQLite. We created a Pokemon app and placed that app under installed apps in settings. We went into models inside of our Pokemon app and created a Pokemon model where it has two fields, name and level. Name being a character field that will only allow up to 50 characters, and level being an integer field that is default to 2. After that, we made migrations, which created this record here of what it's doing. We see that it's the initial one. It has no prior dependencies because it's the initial creation. And we can see that it's creating a model. And then afterwards, we migrated everything. And we can see all the migrations here so that everything can populate inside of our SQL database.
What was the code for migrating it? Sorry.
Yeah, it's going to be, for the actual migration, it's just migrate. For making the records is make migration.
Thank you.
So now over everything that we have just covered, which is a lot. Yep, definitely. Dakota, thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a question on initial. So is this kind of like the Django way of keeping track of each changes you make, similar to a GitHub version tracker, or kind of what's the how does this continue on? Is it always going to be 001, or does that increment every time you
Yeah, no, definitely. And I'm so sorry. I think you broke up a little bit. It's probably just me, but from what I'm tracking, you're asking about the migrations file and how it's being created and what's its purpose, right? So basically Django creates this as exactly what you just said, a record, right? It's able to know okay, well, this happened here, this is when it happened, and this is what it's doing. And each individual migration is happening. Now, a good benefit to that is that at some point, right, let's say you make a bad migration, you could definitely go in there and erase the migration altogether. Or what you can do is erase up to the migration that you think everything went wrong, drop your database, and then recreate your database. And we'll go over how to save our data and all of that. But it's definitely not something that we really want to interact with. It's more so that we can keep an actual physical record of what we've been doing with the database. Does that make sense, Della? Okay, perfect.
I have a question real quick.
Yeah.
Is this more along the lines of we're custom setting up our environment for the way we would, or would we normally go through these steps every time we go through making setting up our environment and stuff?
Yeah, every single time that you make a Django project, you would go through all of these steps. Which I know right now it sounds like a lot, but by the time you guys get to Friday, it's going to be like second nature.
I got a quick question.
Yeah.
So that manage.py file, that you have in there, is that auto-generated or is that's something you have to make? 'Cause I noticed
Yes.
you use that a lot to do everything.
Right, so that manage.py file gets auto-generated once I run the Django admin create project. It created both this project directory and manage.py inside of my root directory. And whenever you create a project doesn't exist unless it has a manage.py. They kind of coexist because without manage.py, your project has no functionality. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Of course.
Was your select statement to the Pokemon app, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Okay, well now let's go into the actual Django console, because as I specified, now we could use Python, right? And we're not necessarily going to go into writing queries in Python just yet, but what we can do is demonstrate how we can insert some new models utilizing the Django shell. So again, let's go into Python, manage.py. We're going to run shell here. And we can see that it brings me into a Python shell, right? So I'm using Python 3.11. Oh, that's a new one. And we see that I'm on Darwin, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, now what's the difference between this and an actual Python and a regular Python shell? Well, this shell here is able to import anything from my project. So in this case, I want to import my model. And we know a little bit about imports when it comes to Python. So I'm going to say from Pokemon app. Oh, no. From Pokemon app. Now, where in Pokemon app is it that I wanted to grab from? Well, I wanted to grab from models. All right, I don't need to put PY. And I wanted to import the class of Pokemon. And when I run this, we don't see an error populate, which means it was successful. All right. And now the next thing I could do is, let's say I want to create a Pokemon. So now I'm going to say Pikachu is equal to Pokemon dot, and then I could say dot objects dot create. But as we know from OOP, we can create a new instance of a class by passing parentheses name, give it a name. So in this case, it's going to be Pikachu. And then the next thing that I need is level, but I don't necessarily need a level because I passed in a default value, all right? So I can just go ahead and close it off like this. Okay, and just like that, I created a Pikachu. And just in case, I'm going to go ahead and save it. Okay, so what exactly did this do, right? I created an instance of a class, and then I saved it. But what is that doing, and why is that important to me? Well, now when I go here into my SQL, if I run the same query, now we can see that that Pikachu that I created is actually populating as a row. We can see that it has the ID of 1. It has the name of Pikachu, just like I told it to. And then we can see that it has the level 2 because that's the default level that I gave it. So even though I didn't pass an argument in there, it was able to grab the default value and create it inside of my database. Does anyone have any questions over the Django Python console? That is really cool. I really like the backend, so that's where I spend most of my time in.
Francisco, just kind of before I forget, you mentioned earlier that there's a way to kind of like undo and drop, drop the migrations, drop the database. When you're done, can you go over that, please?
Yeah, definitely. I think this is the last portion of our lesson for the day. So I'll answer any other questions, and after that, I'll go over how to drop the migration. How to drop the database.
So you essentially created an instance Pikachu here, right?
Right.
And then where did save come from? Have we used that before somewhere?
Yeah, so we haven't used that before, and that's a really good question. So .save is essentially what creates the actual entry into my Pokédex.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Never used two separate terminal sessions at the same time. Is that normal practice while working with backend stuff? Yeah, to answer your question, Ethan, it kind of just depends on you. I personally don't like having to go into two different things when I'm trying to develop. Especially once you start running a full stack application, you're more than likely going to have React running on one terminal, Postgres on another, and then Django running in a completely separate one. At some point, you'll find yourself probably using like 5 or 6 terminals.
Well, so we can't use, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I was gonna ask, you said the save goes into the database, that puts that into the database, so what does the import part do? Where are you importing it into?
Oh, yeah, so the import this?
Yeah, because you said save is what actually puts it into the database, but when you import Pokemon, where does that get imported? I'm just used to like seeing in Python files when you import from one file to the other, so I'm trying to figure out where that goes.
Yeah, so this Pokemon here, that's in reference to the class, right? So currently right now, my Python shell doesn't have any access to this class unless I import it. So I told it to go find the Pokemon app, go into the models, and then import the Pokemon class that I had created so that I could create some Pokemon instances. Does that answer your question?
Oh, okay. Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Of course.
Just
I
to
have a question.
confirm,
Oh. Go ahead, Michael.
all right, just to confirm real quick, earlier I thought you were saying we wouldn't be able to use Django in conjunction with React, but we can? Or is that what we're gonna be doing when we create our personal projects and stuff? Like, are we gonna be using both?
Yeah, so you will be utilizing both, but they're going to be independent from each other. And we'll go over that once we go into full stack application, but currently right now, I can't really address that question at the full extent that I would like.
Yeah, I'm just curious if we could use both. Thank you.
Of course. Any other
I just
questions?
had a question on so like kind of probably the next step would be to like import the actual Pokemon API and like pull like the name and the level from that database into your table. Is that so like with that, it's like, would you want to use JavaScript though? Because that's kind of what we learned from like pulling data through APIs was through JavaScript.
Yeah, so you're talking about making requests to another API, and we'll go over that later on. Currently right now, what we're creating is our own database with our own database entries and our own API. So we won't be interacting with Poke API at all throughout this module. All right. So using the shell will let us not have to import anything, but otherwise, is it like using a different script and importing what we need? Essentially, yeah, Jesse. It's essentially just creating a file, right? The Python shell, and then you could import whatever you need into that Python shell so that you can utilize it. But the benefit between using this over a regular Python is that if you were in a regular Python and you try to import the Pokemon class, it would fail because it would tell you, I have no idea what this is. Or even if it does succeed at importing the class, it wouldn't be able to interact with it because it's not sharing the same virtual environment. While the Python shell, the Django Python shell does share the same virtual environment and actually has access to the functionalities of that class. Okay, perfect. I need those too, Katie.
Are you just doing this in the shell for like testing purposes, or would we do this for some other reason?
Yeah, so this is specifically just for demonstration. We'll go over how to interact with our models later on. But first we need to understand how to create models and what actually a model is before we can start interacting with it to the full extent.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Okay. Chris is laughing pretty hard, so there must be something going on in the classroom. But other than that, is there any other questions?
We were talking about super long screens. Like get one of those sideways ones.
All right, perfect. So we're at exactly at an hour mark. So this is a good time to go ahead and hit a natural stopping point. So we're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and go straight into our group exercises. I'll see everyone in a bit. All right, just to recap for the recording purposes, we were able to create requirements.txt by utilizing the pip freeze command. Pip freeze is basically going to dump all of our installments into a file called requirements.txt, we saw it generate here. And we saw that all of the things that we have installed thus far to create our Django project are inside of our requirements.txt. All right, so now when it comes to gitignores, we're going to go ahead and utilize touch gitignore. And once gitignore populates, it's currently just going to be an empty file. All I'm going to do is say pass in env, and that's going to tell it to ignore that env. So now let's say I run git init here. We can see these files being highlighted in green, meaning that Git is tracking them. It knows that they exist, and it's keeping a history of everything that gets updated or created inside of this directory that I just initialized Git in. But we see that env, currently right now, it's darkened. It doesn't get highlighted green. Well, that's because gitignore is strictly contacting my local Git and saying, hey, inside of this directory, you don't have to worry about this specific folder. So don't touch it. And it works the same with files, right? I could go ahead and say, hey, don't touch manage.py. And then it will update, and now it's not tracking manage.py. We can see that get erased, right? And that's how gitignores work. But just to clarify, gitignores are strictly interacting with your local Git, not GitHub, not any of the stuff that lives on the actual internet, but only your local Git that lives inside of your machine. All right, any questions over that?
Would we include that password in there as well, or the secret thing?
Yeah, so that will go into .envs, and we're not there yet, but I will definitely ensure that gets covered before the end of today. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah. So before we create our VNV, we want to make dir for project and go into it first, right? It seems like there's a lot of confusion about where the virtual environment should be placed. So just to clarify to everyone, your virtual environment can live anywhere in your machine. It doesn't matter where it's placed. It could be placed inside of the same folder directory. It could be placed in your desktop. It could be placed wherever you would want to place it. As long as you have access to it and you can find it easily to be able to activate it, it doesn't matter where it's placed. You just want to make sure it doesn't get pushed up to GitHub. Does that answer your question, Jesse?
What do you mean by find it to access it?
Yeah, so let's say I do something like cd tilde, right? And then here I have all this miscellaneous stuff. So now let's say I do something like make dir environments. Okay, so now inside of environments, I can go ahead and say python-m. Oh, sorry. I want to cd into environments. Okay, so now inside of environments, I can place, I can move this env in here. And as long as I'm able to, from my directory, say, okay, well, I want to, oh, not this one. From here, I'm able to say like source and then tilde environments. And then if there was an environment in there, put in the environment and activate it, then it doesn't matter. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah, I think so. I had just like made it in my like home directory and then created like a folder and tried to activate it, and it was saying like not found. So I think maybe I just need to actually find it.
Looks like it's something with the path. Yeah. So
Thanks.
I would just cd into that specific path and then just use pwd, copy and paste the path, and then that way you're good to go.
Thanks.
Of course. All right. So we covered quite a bit today. And I know we've had some great questions, but I think the best way to build some better questions is to get a little bit of practical application. So let's break down our little group assignment real quick. Let me bring it over. At the very bottom of the README of the lesson, you'll see the assignments. It's called the API activity. And today I just want everyone to go over exercise 1. We have these fields. I just want everyone to create their virtual environment and just go ahead and create this table, right? We have a couple of strings, integers, and booleans. Nothing too crazy. I just want everyone to get some practice with creating an application, well, creating a project, I guess creating a virtual environment, creating a project, creating an app, creating the DB, and linking everything together. So everyone should see that at the bottom of the README. Please let me know if you don't see it. But other than that, I'm gonna go ahead and open up the breakout rooms, and then we'll break out into our small group sessions. All right, let's go ahead. I'm gonna pause.
Are we gonna start working with the Pokemon API again?
Yeah, we will continue working on the Pokemon API, Ethan.
Okay, just trying to make sure I have it brought back up. Thank you.
Okay, perfect, no problem. All right, so let's go ahead and expand on Django ORM, right? Just as we saw, that error there was kind of there put on purpose, where we're asking for everyone to check for an email field, right? It's like, okay, well, we see that it's extremely complicated to check for an email field, right? We could create some sort of regex to try to handle that. But luckily, Django ORM kind of has some built-in functionality for us to use to put extra constraints. So here we can see kind of a bike, right? And here's an example of a bike. And take this as an example as to a data table. Let's say we have a data table and that data table is a bike. Well, we have a frame and we have different parts. But all of these parts are different in their own way and they're unique. So Django provides us a way to make sure that each individual part fits exactly how we want it to as far as data capture goes. When we did the SQL workshop, a lot of you asked, I can't remember their names, but a lot of you asked the individuals who gave the workshop a lot of questions about how do I control the data and how do I validate data to ensure that it's going in correctly? Well, Django is providing us all these fields to ensure things are going in correctly. And we could look at the fields here shortly, but let's go into when to use null. All right, so a lot of people have a problem where they're utilizing null everywhere. We don't necessarily want this. And there's actually a guide that specifies when it's a good idea to use null and when it's not a good idea to use null. When to use blank and when it's not a good idea to use blank. And I'm not going to insult anyone's intelligence. Everyone will have access to this chart. I'll make sure that those links get adjusted, but just in case you don't get the links, it's also inside of the GitHub curriculum under expanding on more Django ORM. You'll see the same exact table that I'm showing here on the slides. But the main thing to get out of this on the slide deck is to appreciate the small programming memes that we have here on the side. All right, so any questions over like the fields that are, I guess we can't really have questions if we haven't demonstrated the fields. So I'm going to keep pushing forward until we get there. All right. So we're going to go over fixtures and all that good stuff. So fixtures, Django needs a way to be able to back up your data. And essentially what a fixture is, Umar went really in depth into JSON files just recently. And everyone was like, whoa, why are we going so in depth into JSON files when we're learning about SQL database? Well, here's where that JSON knowledge is going to come in handy. Now that we have all of these files and all of these entries inside of our database, let's say we need to make a alteration to our database, a change to the field. Well, now we're going to use these fixtures to back up all of our current data so that in case whatever change we make ends up breaking something, we could unapply it or get rid of it and then just utilize our fixtures to load data back up again. All right, so let's take a look at what that looks like. So currently we're inside of our Pokemon app. We already created this app here. Let's go inside of the models. And let's think about the different things that we can have in our model. Well, one thing that sticks out to me first is on line 6, we have this integer field, right? But an integer field, technically a negative number is also an integer, right? And luckily for us, Django provides us such a functionality to ensure that this value is always positive. And that, as many of you could guess, is called a positive integer field. And now that's going to automatically set it so that everything is either 0 or a positive number. So now there's a couple of ones, but the main one that I want to highlight is date time field. So let's say we add a captured, right? What kind of capture, what kind of model field would this be?
Boolean.
Date, time. Oh.
We can make it a Boolean field, and then we could say that all Pokemon are wild. So let's make it a default of false. And you know, we could give it a description. I know most Pokemon do have description, so. And then we could either turn this into a char field, or we could turn this into a text field. Now, can anyone tell me what the difference between a character field and a text field would be? Yeah, so a character field, right? It only counts characters. So if I put a space in there, that's still technically a character, and that all falls under my count. And we can see that when I make a character field, I'm not sure if you guys tried it, but if I don't put max length in there, this fails and it completely falls apart. It needs to know what the max length of characters it is that I'll allow. Now, a text field does not have that limitation. A text field can get paragraphs upon paragraphs upon paragraphs of text and save it directly into our database. Now, if I think about it from a front-end perspective, right, and I'm communicating with the back-end team, let's say I'm creating some type of user interface where the user can give me feedback, right? When I make that input field on the front end, would that be an input field or would that be a text area? Yeah, so that would fall under as a text area. And that was a question for everyone. So just so everyone's tracking, that got pretty silent. So that would fall under as a text field. And basically a text field kind of shares the same capabilities. A text field doesn't have a limitation on how many characters it can take in, while a regular input field, eventually it does get maxed out. So that's the main difference between a text field and a char field. Boolean field, as we know, it's only going to be true or false. We've already gone over email field. It doesn't make sense for a Pokemon to have an email, so I'm not going to worry about that. But the next thing that I do want to do is maybe go over date captured, right? And maybe in date captured, I can say, well, in date captured, I wanted to have a date. So here's a couple of different ones. I can either have a date field or a date time field. So let's just say I want a date field, right? Now, there's a couple of differences here in a date field, and I wonder if this will work here. Nice. Let's take a look here. Those are relationships. No. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out if there's a way that I could show everyone how everything's being interpreted, but I don't think there is, unfortunately. So a date field, when it comes through, if I take a look at a Python shell, and let's say I just want to do, I think it's time. I think I could import time. And then I want to print time dot now. I think that's the right answer. Okay. Okay, I'm not sure what exactly how it works with time. Maybe I could look it up real quick. Okay, there's a way of doing it utilizing a different module other than the one that we're importing here. But the one that we're importing here from Django, well, this has its own package. And what we want to do is we want to go ahead and grab from Django.utils.timezone. So we're going to import that. And actually, I'm going to import now from there. And then I'm going to go ahead and say to print now. And now we can see how the time zone is being interpreted. We have a date, which is 2023, the month, the date, and then we can see the specific time broken down all the way to the millisecond. Well, this is a date time field. So I can also do something like .date, and then it could just give us the date. And this is the way that Django is going to store that data into our database in this specific format. Now, why is this important to know? Well, if you're utilizing something like JavaScript and you grab a date from JavaScript, the date in JavaScript is not in this exact format. It's actually backwards. It's 11/07/2023. So you need to make sure you take that into account, because as we move forward and we start developing our application, it's interacting with our front end. If we just send a date that's not formatted correctly into the back end, then our back end is going to treat that as an error and tell it that it's not a valid input. So that's the reason why it's important to kind of go a little bit more in depth into each of these individual fields. But you guys could look at the Django documentation to be able to go a lot more in depth into everything that's happening inside of the fields. So now let's go ahead and go over a little bit into fixtures. I created all of these things, but I don't want to apply these changes unless I have a fixture that's backing up my data. So let's see where my current Django shell here is. I think I can just put exit here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create a fixture. And I think it will work. Let me try it this way. I'm going to go ahead and say, I'm going to make my fixtures folder. So I'm going to say McDear or make directory. I'm going to go into the Pokemon app. And I'm going to make a folder named fixtures. Okay, so now we see this fixtures folder that was created. Nothing's in there currently. Well, let's put something in there. Well, I'm going to use manage.py. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass the dump data command. And this dump data command is basically going to interact with Postgres and say, hey, I want all of this data from this specific table. So now I'm going to specify the table. I wanted to grab from Pokemon app. And the table that I want to grab from is Pokemon. And then I can pass in a couple of arguments to make it look nice, like -- indent. And I'm going to tell it to indent by 2. And then after that, I'm going to say Pokemon fixture .json. And I actually think I have to specify the entire route in there. So I'm just going to go ahead and specify the route. Okay, well, what exactly is going to happen when I run this? Okay, so no command named indent, and that's because I put a space in between the slash. Okay, so unable to serialize database, column Pokemon app.com. Okay, so right now it's freaking out because I have these fields. So I'm just going to go ahead and comment those out. Okay, so now it worked properly. Now, when I take a look at my fixtures, we see this Pokemon fixture has populated in there. When I click on this file, well, now my Pokemon that I currently created is here inside of a JSON format. Now, why is this good to know? When I go ahead and share this with other developers, or other developers try to pull this down, or I need to share specific data with other developers, I can dump it straight from my database into a JSON file, and then share the specific JSON file with another developer, and then they could install this fixture onto their file. So let's take a look at what that would look like. Well, I'm going to go ahead and make another Pokemon using JSON. So now this model, we can see that the model is the same one. So I wanted to go into the Pokemon app, Pokemon. We need to make sure it has a different primary key. And let's say that this is Charizard. Let's give him level 25. Well, now we're going to run the same command. Well, almost the same command. But instead of dump data, we're going to say load data. And it's going to grab from Pokemon _ fixtures.json. And it looks like I may have to specify the path here as well. Let me make
You
sure.
did fixture, not fixtures.
Thank you. Okay, and now we see that I installed 2 objects from 1 fixture. Well, what does that look like here inside of my database? Well, now Charizard is also included in my database with the level 25. And I did that without utilizing the shell. It's all happening through the fixture interaction. Does anyone have any questions over fixtures and fields?
Do you go back and show that fixtures code real quick? Sorry.
Yeah. So this one's for creating a fixture, and this one's for installing a fixture. It's also on our curriculum.
Does it need the indent too? What did that do? They just indented every line?
Yeah, so let's try it out with the indent. Well, without the indent, I just get one massive single line JSON dump. Does that answer your question, Roger?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Of course.
I'm sorry, can you explain the concept of where the JSON file is coming from?
Could you say your question again real quick?
Yes, so with this command, where did they pull the JSON file? Because I don't remember us creating any JSON file. Can you explain that?
Yeah, definitely. So we never created a JSON file, actually. What ended up happening is when I ran this command of dump data, it's saying, okay, well, where is it that you want me to dump this data? And actually what's great in the JSON file is this arrow, right? So once I put this right arrow, I'm saying, hey, I want you to dump all of this data, and this is where I want you to dump it. And I want you to dump it in this specific path. I want you to go to Pokemon app, fixtures, and then Pokemon fixture.json. So if that doesn't exist, it's just going to create that fixture for us. Does that answer your question, Abu?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Of course.
So you just opened up that JSON file that was created by that, and you were able to create the Charizard right in there. And once you saved it, it was a thing.
Yeah, so that's where load data comes in, where now I'm loading the data, and what that's doing is it's running this JSON file against my table to create all of those instances.
Okay, gotcha. Thank
That
you.
was you simulating as if like you were receiving data from somebody else and you want to load it to your database, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
So because you dump the data from Pokemon app fixtures, that's the only place where Pokemon fixture.json can load data to. Is that right?
Could you say one more time?
So because you did that, you did the dump data first, and you dump that data from Pokemon app.pokemon to the JSON file. So if you're going to do that in reverse, like if you're going to load data, I'm assuming that that data can only go back towards the Pokemon app, since that's where it came from originally.
Got it. Okay, so that data, it knows where to store the data from here, from line 11. I'm telling you exactly where to go. So I'm telling it, hey, I want you to only put this, make this entry inside of the Pokemon app.pokemon. So if I had a different app or different data and it was all inside of this JSON file, this model would look different, and then it would install that data into that specific data table.
Okay, yeah, I completely spaced on that. I was looking in the terminal. that makes sense.
No problem at all. There's a question on the chat. There's a couple of questions. Noah, the way I fixed it is I had a spelling error, so you likely have a spelling error as well. And then for Robert, your question is, what if the PK is already taken? So that's a really good question. Let's go ahead and run it where both PKs are 1, right? So currently right now, I have both of my Pokemons. I have Pikachu and Charizard, and they both have a different primary key. Well, now what happens if I run this where they're sharing the same PK. Okay, so it's telling me it still installed two fixtures. It still installed two objects from one fixture. Now let's go in here. And let's run this. Okay, well now we see that my old number 2 of Charizard still exists, right? But now that I changed the primary key to 1, Pikachu's gone. And that's because since the primary key of 1 is taken by my Charizard, it was able to overtake that. Right? And it never took the original Charizard that had the primary key of 2 because nowhere did I tell it to mess around with that. Did that answer your question, Robert?
I'm just wondering if you're like sharing one Pokemon with the JSON to somebody else, some other developer, how do they know what keys are available?
Yeah,
if they want to. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so whenever I go to dump my information, so this is just simulating. You would never want to interact with the JSON file, like creating an instance yourself like this, the way I did. You would only want this JSON file to be compiled from dump data. This way, the other developer can just install it in without corrupting any of the information that is on his machine. Does that make sense? His or her machine, sorry. Or their machine.
Okay, so they're not using the JSON to like add to the database. That's kind of what I was going for.
Correct. All right. And let me go ahead and load data here. Let me run this select query again. I don't know what happened to my webcam, but it just had a smoke and doesn't. Okay, thank you so much, Roderick. All right, so we just went over a couple of things. We went over fixtures. We went over how to mess around with fixtures. And let's look at what adding this information into our model looks like. So currently right now, I already have data in place. I'm going to try to make these changes real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and make migrations. Okay, well, it's giving me a problem, not necessarily an error, but it's telling me, hey, you already have data that exists, and this data that already exists doesn't have these values. So you either have to provide a default, or we can provide one ourselves. So I'm going to go ahead and give it 2, saying that I'm going to provide it on my own, and I'm just going to give it a default of none. And then for this one, I'm going to give it a default of, or actually, let's make this blank true and null true. So this way I don't have to worry about it. Okay, so now I can run migrations. And now I'm going to go ahead and migrate. Okay, and now that I migrated, well, now if I go back to my SQL terminal, if I run this, we can see that the new fields were added. And now the main thing that we also want to see is if we take a look at migrations, well, now migrations also has a 002. And if I look in there, we can see that dependencies now has a tuple inside of it, where it's referencing to 001, like a linked list, as we mentioned previously. And then it's talking about all the fields that it's creating all belong into that Pokemon field, into that Pokemon.
Why did you have to add those defaults?
Because I already had data that existed, right? I had the entry of Pikachu and Charizard, but they didn't have these fields before. So by adding these fields, I have to give them values. They can't just automatically be null or false. Django won't let you do that. So it asks you to either explicitly tell it to let it be null or to let it be blank, or provide default values to be able to interact with that data. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
For migrations, is Python manage py make migrations and then Python manage py migrate. Okay. Perfect. Let's see how we're doing on time. All right, we're still good on time. Let's go ahead and run into the admin site real quick. And then once we run into the admin site, we'll go ahead and kind of call it a little break, and I'll address questions for everyone. So the next part is we're going to create a super user and interact with our admin site. So I'm gonna go ahead and go into admin. And here we have this admin function. And I'm gonna access this admin. And I'm going to register a specific list of models. So in this case, the model that I want to make sure I register, well, I want to grab from models. So from .models, I want to import Pokemon. And that's what I want to be registered on my site, will be Pokemon. Okay. Well, I have that, and that looks nice and everything. But what does that mean? What is that really doing for me? Well, now that I have that inside of my registered apps, I can go ahead and create a super user. And when I run this, it's going to ask me, okay, well, what username do you want to use? So I'm just going to use FR. It's going to ask me for my email address. There's no actual confirmation on this, so you can put whatever you want in there. And then it's going to ask me for a password. I'm going to use something short. So it's going to tell me, hey, this is short and it's not really safe. Are you okay? Or you want to bypass the password validation? I'm going to bypass it. Okay. So now we see a super user was created. Again, what does that even mean? Why does that matter? Well, let's run the server real quick. And what the server is going to do, oh no, it's already occupied. I have another thing that's running real quick. Okay, so now I run the server. All right, and what the server is going to do is going to actually run a site or a project inside of my local host. So now if I click on this, let me go back over here. Now we can see this Django rocket show up. And this is actually really cool because when I go to refresh this site, one, I get an animation of the Django rocket just kind of running, right? But if I look at my actual console here, or my terminal, I'm sorry, we can see that there was a GET request that has been sent. Right. So now I'm actually interacting, seeing like, oh, hey, what's going on? What's happening? What is it that I'm building? So this is a small portion of what we're building. We're starting to create our API, and on GET requests, it's rendering that template of a rocket jumping up and down whenever it gets rendered. Okay, but what I want to take a look at is the admin site. And this is one of the biggest benefits behind utilizing Django. So if I run /admin, it takes me to this Django administration portal. So now I can go ahead and place my username, my password, and I can log in. Okay, I don't want you to remember this. All right, so now I logged into my Django administration console. And we can see that I have these Pokemons here. Well, what's in there? If I take a look at Pokemon, we see that they have this object 1 and object 2. And if I click on them, I can actually see the information, right? But I don't like the way this looks, this Pokemon object. So how can I change that? I remember in OOP, when I printed out an instance, I would see a memory space. But if I wanted to change that memory space for a specific string, I would have to apply some sort of method to that class. Does anyone remember what that method was and how to apply it?
Like the def string method?
Yeah, we got the string method. So let's go over to our model here. Let's go ahead and make our string method, which is going to take in self, and then it's going to just return self.name. Okay, and then we can see all of this recompile. Now, if I refresh the site, well, now instead of showing me those objects, it's showing me the actual name of each individual Pokemon. I can take a look at Charizard, right? I can even do CRUDing requests here. I can say, hey, this is a Charizard, and it's a fire type. Right, and I could change its capture to being true, and I can say the date captured, well, that was today. Okay, and then after I edit all of that, I'm gonna go ahead and save it. Okay, we see the Pokemon Charizard, the changes were saved. Okay, well, if they were saved, then that means my database should also reflect those changes. So let's take a look here. Now we can see that Charizard at ID of 2 has been captured. It's true. It was captured today. It has the correct format, and it has my description in there. It's cut off, unfortunately, but my description's in there. All right, and that's how our Django admin site works. All right.
Do we have time for a quick question real quick?
Yeah, actually, this was the perfect time for questions. Please go ahead.
So you hit run server and then what happened? Because I'm hitting run server and then nothing's. Do you have to type something in?
Yeah, so it should be Python manage py run server.
Yep. And then yeah, nothing's. Do I have to like open up an internet browser or?
Yeah, so once you run this, this should happen. You should see this.
Yep. Oh, okay, and then you just put in the.
Right.
Okay, yep.
Just click on that link, and that will take you there to this. It will take you to the rocket bouncing up and down. After that, you could go to the URL and then place in /admin, and that will take you to the admin site.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. All right, everyone. We definitely covered a lot of material today. But that's a good thing because now we're actually starting to put everything that we've compiled over the time and putting it all together. So with that said, we still got 15 minutes, and I think this is the perfect time to start going into questions. So please, any questions that you have or concerns, I know this was a long lesson, but it's better to ask it now than going into lunch and then coming back after lunch and having all the questions still left over. So what do we got?
So I missed the part where you. Okay, so I was having this error whenever I was like, what was it? Migrating my data, and it was like you can't have date as a null value. Did you manually type in now or null when you did that?
We typed in both of these. Yes.
Oh, nice. Okay, that makes more sense. Yeah, that's what I missed, and I was like, oh my gosh. Anyway, that's it.
Okay, of course, no problem at all. I can definitely try to get it uploaded before lunch ends, but that's not really in my control. That's kind of up to YouTube. No questions at all. Everyone just feels good about Django.
I think just like a lot of information to process.
Also, a
Yeah.
lot of things to practice. So,
Okay, perfect. Yeah, in that case, then I won't take up anyone's time. I fully understand. I will be available this entire afternoon. So please, if at any point anyone has questions, either just ping me on Slack or hop into my room, and I'll make sure to answer your questions right away. So I'm gonna go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
I don't think you need it for the recording if you want to stop it, but this is just like administrative, I guess. For our next assessment, do you know when it's due?
The assessment will be handed out on Friday, and it won't be due until the first day of class, which I believe is Wednesday. But let me check the calendar just to ensure I am telling you the correct information. Oh, it won't be until Thursday. So Thursday morning will be when your assessment is due.
Okay. And is this and it's like I know you said it's also like the halfway point, which is why we kind of have more time off. Do you like kind of expect that this next assessment is going to be taking this amount of time, like all through the weekend and through Wednesday to kind of do? Like, is that also why we have extra time or?
No, the main reason why we have extra time is because we're at the halfway point. I don't want anyone to be freaking out. I think the OOP assessment 1 was probably like 5 or 6 times harder than what you're about to do for SQL. SQL's it's extremely simple. So everyone please relax.
Okay.
thank you. Thank you for saying that.
Of course, no problem. All right, perfect. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording now.